Thank you all for coming. My name is Paul Lohmann. I am a postdoc at the El-Erian Institute of Behavioral Economics and Policy, which is based at the Judge Business School. And I want to present an overview of my work today, which all focuses on policy interventions to promote sustainable food consumption. Just a little bit of background about myself. I did my PhD here in Cambridge at the Department of Land Economy, and that's where I started working on this topic. I was looking at sustainable behavior change in general, and I thought that if we're going to look at individual behavior change, and there's a big debate about this sort of systemic and individual behavior change, then I think it's worthwhile looking at some of these behaviors which have high potential to reduce people's carbon footprints, so high impact behaviors. And food consumption is one of these. At least in the Western world, there's a lot of room for us to shift our diets to be more sustainable. And that's why I decided to pursue this during my postdoc at the El-Erian Institute. And it's what I'm now primarily working on. And I want to share a few of the results from recent studies, but also from one of the papers from my PhD. I also want to highlight that nearly all of the work I'm presenting today is joined with Elisabeth Zottbauer from the LSE and Professor Lucia Reich, who is the director of the El-Erian Institute. And one of the projects is also in collaboration with the UK Behavioural Insights team. But why should we care about changing diets in the first place? In this very brief introduction, I'm going to focus on the climate impact of food and agriculture. There are, of course, many other good reasons for us to change the way we consume and produce food, including public health, animal welfare, antibiotic resistance, biodiversity loss, the list goes on. I'm going to focus here on the climate impact. Most of you are probably aware that the global food system is responsible for quite a large share of global greenhouse gas emissions. Some estimates place this at about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. More recently, that's been estimated to be up to a third. And what is very clear is that over half of this footprint from the global food system comes from animal agriculture. So 58% is contributed by animal products. And one of the driving factors for that is, in fact, land use and land use change. Just to show you a few statistics here, animal agriculture uses 83% of agricultural land globally, but it produces only 18% of global calories and 37% of protein. And that is simply because it is incredibly inefficient to grow crops, which are then fed to animals, which are then ultimately consumed by us. That's because of the continual loss of energy due to metabolic activity as we move further up the food chain. So only a fraction of energy available at one of these trophic levels is then transferred to the next. The rule of thumb here is 10%. That does vary depending on what we're looking at. But clearly, maybe a fun statistic to illustrate this, one paper showed that if the entire US switched from beef to beans, that would, so substitute all beef with beans, that would free up approximately 42% of agricultural land, which could then be used for other agriculture or simply left for rewilding and biodiversity purposes. But which foods are actually better or worse for the climate? This figure shows the kilogram of greenhouse gas emissions per 100 gram protein. So these are all protein-rich foods. And as you can see here, sort of the top 8-9 foods are all from animal sources, and then only tofu is next in the list. And just to illustrate the magnitude of difference here, beef results in up to 105 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams. So that's at the top and the 90th percentile of this range. Clearly, there's a big range in impacts depending on all sorts of factors. But tofu produces less than 3.5 kilograms. So that's a factor of 30 difference. So what could a sustainable diet actually look like? This is the Planetary Health Diet, which was developed by the Eat Lancet Commission. As you can see here, about half of this diet needs to consist of fruit and vegetables, and protein needs to come primarily from plant sources. So that is pulses, legumes, nuts, but this diet actually does leave some room for animal protein and dairy to a very small amount. So what are the options for government to actually change behavior and to encourage more sustainable diets? And to conceptualize this a little bit, I want to use an analogy from the most recent report by the Behavioural Insights team called How to Build a Net Zero Society. I think it's a nice way of thinking about different levels of policy intervention. But I basically want to imagine that we are all swimmers in a stream. And as swimmers, we have some degree of agency, so we can choose to swim one way or the other. But this stream also has a current of its own. And this current reflects our current social norms and incentive structures for both producers and consumers, which are clearly pushing us into in an unsustainable direction at the moment. And the first level of intervention is the downstream level. So we could target individuals directly through educational campaigns, information provisions such as carbon footprint labels, and all sorts of other tools to try to persuade people to make more sustainable choices, or educate them to make more sustainable choices. But we need to keep in mind that there's still this stream, this current that is pushing them into an unsustainable direction. So the next level of intervention is the midstream level. And the whole idea is here that we could calm the waters and make it easier to make a more sustainable choice. And that might be through sort of vegetarian, vegan defaults, changes in the oil, in the choice architecture. That could be making the plant-based meals more available relatively to other options, making them more affordable or more socially acceptable. And research has shown that these interventions can have really quite large effects on behavior, but ultimately they don't change the direction in which the stream is flowing. So ultimately we need more systemic interventions upstream, which would try to redirect the flow of the stream. That might be, in an extreme case, a ban on meat. It's very politically unlikely, but perhaps a carbon tax, which is widely accepted as being a powerful tool to change incentive structures, or other forms of regulation and standard setting. But what does the public actually think about these policies? This is a recent study published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology, where they asked the UK public whether they support or oppose to meat reduction policies. As you can see here, some of these more systemic policies are the least supported or the most opposed, such as increased prices through a meat tax or a carbon tax. And some of the upstream interventions, the downstream interventions, such as labeling or information campaigns, media campaigns, are those which are most supported. So that was a very short introduction. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of my own research in this area, where we've tried to actually test interventions, test some of these interventions to see whether they can actually change people's choices. And the first set of experiments we've done with, in collaboration with restaurants, a UK restaurant chain, an Italian restaurant chain, and they wanted to provide carbon footprint information on their table menus. When you go into the restaurant, you get this menu, and they wanted to provide information there. Specifically, they had this unique option on their menu, which they call a vegan swap, where you can you have a traditional meal like a margarita, and you can swap out certain ingredients to make it vegan, and also substantially reduce its carbon footprint by doing so. So they calculated this carbon footprint reduction, and they wanted to present this on the menu, and this is how we ended up doing it. Make this climate friendly and vegan with mozzarella, reducing the carbon footprint by 69%. So what we did in the experiment was we worked with 16 restaurants, and we split them into two groups. The first group introduced after several months of baseline data collection, introduced these new labels, and the second group just stuck with the old standard menus. And I'll show you a few results straight away. Essentially, we find that the share of vegan swap sales is very low overall. Only about 5 to 10% of sales are actually these vegan swaps, comparing the two options to each other, relative to each other. After several weeks, we introduced the new menus in the treatment group, and we saw perhaps a small increase in the first week in the carbon information group, but after that, there was not much difference over the rest of the trial period. And we can estimate these differences. There were 4 different swaps on the menu, and across all swaps, here you see the percentage point change in the sales share of these vegan swaps. We find that the information on the menus caused a small increase in sales, but none of these were actually statistically significant. So I think the conclusion here is that this very subtle information provision on the menu is unlikely to have a big effect on hungry restaurant customers. And it didn't surprise me very much, to be honest, because the information really wasn't very salient. And we've shown these results to the restaurant, and now they're interested in making this messaging more salient, more prominent, and we're looking to do some follow-up work later on this year. But the next set of experiments I want to talk about are actually in university cafeterias here in Cambridge. Some of this work was done during my PhD. And of course, we are well aware that university cafeterias don't represent the real world, very highly educated students. But they also provide a great source of data, because we are able to receive anonymized individual level sales data of students over the entire academic year. So they're a great setting to actually test interventions. And most of this work has focused on carbon footprint labeling. This is the label we designed in the study that we did just before the pandemic. Just to point out a few design elements here, we use a standard traffic light coloring for the scale that provides sort of normative information about what is good or bad. We provide these 5 categories so that people can put them into context with other meals. And we also provide the actual number of the carbon footprint, which in pre-testing we found some of the students actually preferred to have a number there. And this is a redesigned version of this label by our industry partner, Foodsteps, essentially providing the same information. And then there are different versions of this label for different settings, where more or less information is provided depending also on the target audience. Just very briefly, I don't have time to go into detail about how we calculate the carbon footprints, but essentially it's based on the recipe of these meals, of cafeteria meals, broken down by individual ingredients. And these are matched to a database of life cycle assessment values, so providing information about the average carbon footprint of, say, beef for a kilogram of beef from the UK, and then we can match that and calculate a total carbon footprint for this recipe in kilograms of CO2 per kilogram, which can then also be broken down per serving and placed on a scale to visualize the relative impact of this meal. This is the label in action just before the pandemic in Darwin College, and more recently we've done some follow-up work with the redesigned label and also with additional interventions such as a subsidy on vegan dishes, where we have tried to signal a social norm and also provide a small financial incentive. So what did we find in the first study? We did find that the labels had small but significant effects on people's choices. So people consumed less high carbon meals. There was a decrease of 2.7 percentage points, and that was substituted with an increase in mid-carbon meals. We didn't actually find any significant effect on the green categories here on the scale. And there was no increase in sales of vegan meals, but rather a substitution away from some meat dishes towards fish and some vegetarian dishes that were in this yellow, in this mid-carbon category. And that amounted to about 4.3% reduction in emissions per meal on average over the entire study period. All dishes sold in the cafeterias, that's about 2.4 metric tons of CO2. That isn't a huge amount, but if this intervention were to be scaled across all 31 colleges or even across all university cafeterias in the UK, where we can quite reasonably assume that these effects would probably replicate, that would still amount to quite substantial emissions savings. Sorry. Right, and the final project I want to talk about is the most recent study that we've been working on quite a new setting, online delivery apps. This is a rapidly growing food choice setting, especially since the pandemic. Probably all of you have at some point ordered a meal via Deliveroo or Just Eat. Uber Eats in other countries is quite popular. And we couldn't work with these companies directly, but we decided to build a platform that replicates or mimics this setting quite accurately. And in fact, this was done by the Behavioural Insights team. And as you can see, we have 9 restaurants here. This is the web version. There was also a mobile version. 9 restaurants, which were based on real-world restaurants. And once you choose your restaurant, you see a typical menu screen with starters, mains, desserts, and drinks to make it as realistic as possible. And also the prices were modeled on the real restaurants and only slightly adjusted. And so we recruited a sample of 4,000 people to make a choice on this platform. And we were then able to manipulate this platform and trial different interventions. We had 3 different interventions, the first one being a tax, which was clearly signposted, so a meat tax, in fact, and I'll show you these in a moment. The second one being the labels that we actually used in the cafeterias as well, the carbon footprint labels. And the third one, which we haven't talked about yet, a typical choice architecture technique, where we simply reorder the order of the menu so that the lowest carbon meals were presented first. And we compared these 3 conditions to a control group. And while we couldn't, obviously these aren't real choices people are making on this web platform, but we did try to incentivize the choices. So we gave people a budget of £20 to spend, and we said 1 in 30 participants will be randomly selected to actually receive their order. And the remainder of their budget would then be paid out to their bank accounts. So I ended up actually ordering meals for about 40 people by Deliveroo, which was incredibly stressful, but I think it was worth it. I hope it was worth it to somehow incentivize choices, make them a bit more incentive compatible. I'll quickly show you the interventions. So this was the tax. It was clearly signposted with a small T and a bit of text. And once you actually then selected a meal, this was sort of the selection page where the tax was then added on here as an additional line. And if you hovered over this information icon, there was additional information provided. The label was the same as previously used, and again had these 5 categories, color-coded categories. And once you selected a meal, again, it was quite large and salient. And finally, the reordering was simply done that both on the restaurant page and also the menu page, that the restaurants and the meals were ordered by carbon footprint in ascending order. So the lowest impact meals were presented first. And then we looked at these interventions on several different outcomes, primarily interested in the environmental climate outcomes. So the main outcome variable is the kilograms of CO2 per serving in the basket at checkout. We also looked at the carbon impact score of the main meal chosen, these 5 categories of the label. And we also looked at meal types, so vegan, vegetarian, meat, and fish. We also were interested in some secondary outcome variables, such as calories, were there any health co-benefits, satisfaction, and policy support. And I'll show you a few results now. This first one is the main outcome variable, the emissions per serving. And we see actually that only the repositioning, the reordering intervention had a significant effect and significantly reduced emissions in the basket at checkout. This is reflected by a similar change of 6 percentage points in the choice of high carbon main meals. And interestingly, also, we found some health co-benefits, so people consumed less calories, and really surprisingly, were also more satisfied with their choice in this reordering position. And none of the other conditions had an effect on any of these outcomes in the full sample, at least. Just one additional finding that I want to show you, which I thought was quite interesting. We were interested in how much people already know about the carbon footprint of food, which we call their carbon literacy. So in the pre-intervention survey, we had a short task to rate certain meals into low, mid, and high footprint to get an idea of how much people already know. Some of them were very easy, something like steak and curry, but others were more tricky. So we could create a carbon literacy score and classify people into low carbon literacy, those participants that got most of these questions wrong, and those with high carbon literacy. And for low carbon literacy, we find that, again, only the repositioning had a significant effect, similar to the full sample. But for high carbon literacy, we actually find that all 3 interventions significantly reduced the emissions consumed, and the labels actually had the strongest effect. And my tentative interpretation of this is that the labels might have acted as a form of reminder, as well as the tax, which was quite salient to people that already know more about the carbon footprint of meals and perhaps would like to act in line with their intentions. So that's just a few of the findings from this study. There's a lot to dig into. We have a lot of data here. I've only just started analyzing it. But I just want to draw a few conclusions from this presentation. Coming back to this slide from earlier, I think our research has shown that education and information provision clearly have an important role to play, but it is unlikely that they will result in large, substantial changes in behavior on their own. I nonetheless think that they are very important to build knowledge and awareness in society, and perhaps also build acceptability for more systemic policies, such as a carbon tax or a meat tax, some of these upstream interventions. I think in the meantime, there's a lot of potential for these midstream interventions, choice architecture interventions, to have an immediate impact on people's choices, simply by making it easier to make a more sustainable choice. We saw that simple changes in the choice architecture can have quite large effects on behavior, and several other studies also conducted here in Cambridge, for example, have shown that simply by changing the availability, making the vegan or vegetarian meal relatively more available, have quite large effects on people's choices, and might also make this choice more socially acceptable. So yeah, that's it. I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. This is probably one of my favorite areas in what I do. So I have loads of questions, but I will try not to monopolize the conversation. And I see loads of clapping hands from various people. So that's wonderful. Just a clarification, because I was surprised. Why passata had a high carbon footprint and halloumi more than mozzarella? Because in theory, halloumi is made with sheep, unless it's a fake halloumi, but it should be made with ewe or sheep milk,
Which,
while mozzarella is with cow's milk. It was probably
yes, this is from the slide, from the slide with the recipe, right? That's a good question, actually. I'm not sure about the passata.
I mean, passata is made with tomatoes, so you would think
it's made with tomatoes.
Very low. So this is the pizza expert, and
yeah, this was the I'm not 100% sure, actually. I need to look into that. Generally, dairy products are very high because they contain a lot of concentrated dairy. But I haven't looked into that distinction between mozzarella and halloumi. Actually, that's interesting to look at. Thanks.
I just another very quick question. The carbon literacy, was it also an age factor?
That's I haven't looked at that yet, actually. We have age of the participants. I don't know. I'll look at it.
Okay. I'm giving you lots of work to do now, Paul.
Yeah, that's great. We've only just got this data a couple of weeks ago, and so just basically created these figures very recently, and there's lots to do with the data. Yeah.
Right. More questions and comments, but I'll open up the discussion first. Francisca, I see you have your hand up, unless you've missed out on somebody else. No, Francisca, go ahead.
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for an excellent overview of the topic and the latest studies. I have a question, because all these studies are naturally about choice and people choosing. Is there any research that you might be aware of? What happens if you make the vegetarian or vegan options, which are generally more climate friendly, what if you make those the norm without labeling them such? I mean, I've never heard of someone who eats meat who doesn't at all eat plants, so they would still be accessible. And at an event I organized, for reasons of affordability and for ease of organization, we offered all vegetarian options and no one even commented.
Yeah.
So is there any research whether this bothers people?
I mean, yes, we've seen, we do it ourselves as well now when we organize events, that we have a plant-based default. And often we add some extra layers of sludge to make it really difficult for people that we ask them, please email us if you're not happy with, if you want meat. And then in the end, I think one person out of 100 emailed us, something like that. But there seems to be more anecdotal evidence on this. I think there are a few studies on plant-based defaults, but I'm not 100% sure, actually. I'd need to look that up. But in general, we would say that defaults are very powerful, and usually people are happy. And at least when I talk to catering managers or to event organizers, I just say, make sure the plant-based default is good food, high quality, nutritious food, healthy food, and then people won't complain at the end of the day. So yeah.
Following this Francisca's comment, Francisca, have you got any more questions or further comment on this?
No, I personally don't have any questions right now. I'm interested to hear the discussion in general. I just wanted to point out, because if I recall correctly, you also cited the Eat Lancet study and the diet they proposed. Just in case anyone's not yet aware, they're currently recruiting for Eat Lancet 2.0, and you can still sign up in June for their consultations. So if you'd like, I can share the link in the chat. I felt that it might.
Thank you.
But thank you for being so patient with my question.
Thank you, Francisca. Yes, please do share the link. Now, I was about to follow up Francisca's comment, and I would be interested in finding out, Paul, I don't know if you know the answer to this already, but what percentage would it be if, say, for example, the easy targets like schools, hospitals, and prisons changed and adopted that the vegetarian plant-based diet as a default position, given that most of these people will probably not really complain, also don't probably even have a choice, and but will be also healthier for them. What sort of impact this change, which seems to be an easy change, would have?
Yeah, I mean, it will depend, I guess, on context to context, but at least, actually, that just made me remember another sort of more anecdotal evidence. I don't think a scientific study has been done on this, but in New York, they introduced a plant-based default in all hospitals, in all of the major hospitals. And they added an extra layer. So basically, the patients are asked what they want for lunch and dinner, and they would be offered an option, and that would they introduced this plant-based default. And if they didn't want that, the second option would actually also be plant-based. And only if they didn't want that were they offered a range of sort of meat dishes.
Which would have been awful anyway, right? Very badly cooked.
Probably. And I think some statistics, but I'm not 100% sure, was that the uptake was about 72%, or in the 70 range, of people actually going for the plant-based default, just sticking with the plant-based default rather than requesting an alternative. And I mean, yes, we saw from the figure on the protein-rich foods that would have a substantial impact in terms of emissions reductions. If basically we were to swap out all of the animal proteins, some more than others, of course, but to plant-based alternatives.
Any questions or comments? Because I would like to follow up on this, but I don't want to monopolize just because I'm the chair. Please, anyone, comments or questions for Paul or for the group? In that case, Paul, I would like to follow up on this and ask you, so how much then, for example, the health component and also the ethical and welfare components have impact on the switch, on the change? Do people, do people react actually more easily if there isn't particularly a health factor?
Yeah, I think again that depends on the consumer group or the people that are targeted. And some people are definitely more health conscious, and then a health framing will be more impactful than a climate framing. There was one recent study that looked at the acceptability of meat taxes in Germany, and they actually compared a climate framing and an animal welfare framing. And they found that people were much more on board with a meat tax if it was for animal welfare purposes than for the climate. So I think it's key to understanding the preferences of the target audience. If you really want to design effective interventions, then yes, you want to try to understand, do these people actually care about climate change? For example, a label probably won't have any effect on people that don't want this information or don't care about this information at all. There needs to be a certain level of preferences for this sort of information, and similarly for health and animal welfare. There are probably consumer segments that care about this much more, which could be targeted directly.
Yeah, I think the cultural context is very important, right?
Yes, the cultural context. And I think that's also why the Eat Lancet diet actually retains this small proportion of animal protein, because they say the gains of cutting that out completely are relatively small compared to the big ask it is for people to completely cut out meat from their diets, which is often very culturally linked. People would say, well, we've been cooking this for generations in my family, and I don't want to give this up completely. So I think that's why actually the Eat Lancet diet does allow for some animal protein in its diet. Well, clearly it would be, from a climate perspective, preferable to encourage fully vegan or fully plant-based diets. And there's been some modeling on this as well, that basically only a vegan diet would significantly sequester emissions in a future scenario where yields are relatively low, and this Eat Lancet diet would actually not achieve that in a low yield scenario. In a high yield scenario, then both diets would sequester emissions.
Theo, do you have any questions, comments? Especially given Emma's work, I was thinking obviously of the reordering of the menu.
Yes, I think I'm trying to think if there's anything new that comes to mind, but like Paul mentioned, we've also opted the default vegetarian for all our courses that we run, and when we arrange dinners for students, we give them the vegetarian default unless they opt in for meat, and typically that does massively shift the take-up of vegetarian.
Yeah.
But as Paul mentioned, we're not exactly dealing with a representative sample. You know, these are students, especially on our courses, that are quite ideologically committed and wanting to virtue signal to one another as well. So they almost, even if they want the meat, they might be too embarrassed to choose it. But yeah, it is definitely an interesting example for a kind of a nudge approach. But yeah, and I'm just listening with interest because I think it's one of those examples we've been through before where the potential is enormous, but the political will is not. So it's about trying to find a way to close that gap. And even the more challenging examples we've been through before, like electric vehicles and many other things, which obviously also started off with great tension and misgivings amongst the public because there was a lot of cultural commitment to petrol engines, and people said petrol heads would never drive in milk floats and all that kind of thing. But we've seen that that isn't the case. Over time, a combination of technological innovation, culture shift, and so on does change that. And in fact, later this month, we hope some work of some fellows of our institute will be published. There was a guy called Pablo Salas, who was a fellow, and also Ari, I forget his surname, and they were looking at disruptive innovation, and they've come up with a framework. And I think they've identified 5 factors that are needed or that drive shifts in socio-technical systems. Obviously, technology is one of them, policy another one, civil society another, environmental factors, I think they call it, which would be shifting climates and the like would be the other. And then I forget what the 5th one is. But, it's not rocket science. I think we all kind of know these things. And then they actually analyze the food systems, the energy system, and one other system that escapes me. And they illustrate how they're kind of using a classic sort of technology maturity pathway that goes from, everyone denying it, ignoring it, and then you get the lift off where it kind of really gets going. And they show that where some of them are very much at that stage. And once you get to the liftoff, the sort of the forces of those 5 factors change. And food is very much at the kind of immature stage where where you're not seeing that kind of convergence of factors that you need to reach liftoff. And obviously, as proponents of this for all the right reasons, we have to try and think about what can we do to make it more culturally acceptable, to get policy to be more proactive, and of course to also think about how we can ensure that the food that's being offered up that is vegetarian satisfies a wider range of palates. And of course there's been a lot of innovation in this space. I'm not a huge fan myself of the things that try to pretend to be meat when they're not, but I appreciate that for some people to actually make the transition, they're going to want to think that they're eating meat even if they aren't. So there's probably room for all of these things, but at the moment we're very much still at that kind of startup stage where there's a lot of experimentation, but not yet much scale.
Although Theo, actually that's been banned now there's been an Italian law that's just passed in the parliament that bans these sort of products that pretend to be like, the sort of the vegetarian sausage, or this is not bacon, or this is not chicken, and all this stuff.
They ban them trying to make sort of like for false marketing or advertising, claiming to be something that they're not, so that you can't claim to be fake bacon if you're not bacon type of thing. You just have to claim to be
I think there are other political reasons behind this move.
I'm sure.
I think there are probably very few consumers who will be fooled in thinking that they're eating bacon or buying bacon. I don't know.
Yeah, we have got a hand up now. I'm probably.
Yeah, Francisca, you have another question or further comment?
Oh. Sorry. There I am. Both a comment and a question, actually. So for a comment, the EU actually also has these very strange regulations around what is allowed to be called milk. So I'm allowed to talk about or advertise wolf's milk, which is an amoeba, but I'm not allowed to advertise something like almond milk. And when you look at the regulation in detail, it's very obvious that a lot of lobbying has been at work. So I would personally prefer a little more critical thinking among politicians, but that's a wish.
I can see both sides of it, because obviously, it all hinges on what the definition of milk is. And I think in this case, they're probably trying to make it too narrow. But on the other hand, we would all have an objection if somebody sold some sugar flavored orange stuff and called it orange juice. We sort of expect orange juice to come from an orange, and in the same way, I guess there's an expectation that milk comes from a particular method of production. But I think that if you probably look at it more broadly, that milk probably does have a wider definition, and that it shouldn't be monopolized just by animal produced sources.
Well, it's also quite funny in the EU regulation, because only cow's milk is allowed to be labeled as milk. Milk that comes from another animal, like sheep milk or goat's milk, needs to be specified as such. Otherwise, it's also considered false advertising. And at that point, I do wonder who got the exemption for the cow's milk,
Right, the dairy producers, I suppose.
Even
the massive lobby that there is. And actually, this is a question to Paul. I mean, how can we, Paul, also tackle the subsidy issue and, and work also in conjunction with dairy producers and, farmers? And I mean, it's a very delicate, and also financial incentives and safety nets, because I mean, like in the Netherlands, you can't just turn around and now say to everyone, sorry, cows need to be removed, go and do something else.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a good answer to that question, but yes, I think there's definitely, what was I going to say? I mean, clearly we need to build acceptability for more systemic changes. And I think it's also a limitation of my own work, is that it very much focuses on individual consumer behavior, while the whole food system is really quite complex. There are a lot of parts to the different components to the food system, and the consumer is only sort of the end point. So I think one of the sort of the research agenda I want to look into is how we can build acceptability for more systemic interventions that basically change incentives for industry and change social norms in the long run. One potential option is to what's happening now in Germany, for example, is that, or in several EU countries, to basically farmers are being bought out of their pig farms, so simply being paid to close them down, basically, because of animal welfare reasons and sort of local pollution motives. But of course, there are many policy tools, and I don't know how to address lobbying at a political level. But I think if policy support is there to do so, then that's definitely an important starting point.
But see, Paul, this is why we have the GFS, which combines all these elements. So I'm pleased about our Pulse project. But any more questions or comments?
Yeah.
I mean, I had tons, but Francisca,
I do
and then
actually.
we can wrap up.
Because we've been discussing the vegetarian and vegan defaults earlier, and that also made me wonder about a related point. When I speak to people in my vicinity who aren't necessarily scientists about these questions, or who aren't into the whole climate debate that much, I still sometimes get the comments along the lines of rabbit food. And when I ask more detailed questions, there's sometimes this fear among people that if they forego meat, they will be limited to side dishes. So when they think of vegetarian options, they think of eating the French fries without the burger. We're obviously far beyond that. So I was wondering whether there has been any research on this or any projects on this, to not just make it as if, to not just communicate that people are foregoing something, namely animal products, for example, but also that they are gaining something with a wide variety of foods that are available to vegetarians, especially now that there's so many people involved in this, and also that it's not just about, excuse me, the hipster salad at the trendy new bar, but that it's equally, there is a rich history of traditional vegetarian dishes. So yeah, how does that factor into these discussions and the research that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I just came across a study recently by a colleague here in Cambridge. I forgot his surname. He's called Chris. But he did a study specifically on that sort of, he calls it situational myth busting. And he was surveying people, and he found that one of the main barriers was actually that they think a plant-based diet doesn't give them enough protein, which is probably similar to what you're hinting at. He did an experiment with the Greggs sausage roll. I don't know if you're probably not aware of it. In the UK, Greggs is like they do pastries and sausage rolls, and they have a vegan version of their famous sausage roll, which actually contains more protein than the meat version. But people don't know that, and they think, okay, well, the vegan is not going to give me any protein. And he did a simple study where he sort of just provided this information and told people that the protein content, and that led to quite a substantial uptake in the vegan sausage roll. So it seems to be linked to knowledge, and also a lot of this sort of perhaps the more traditional knowledge of vegetarian dishes that are originally vegetarian seems to have gone lost. Just the way our current food system works, and as I was sort of hinting at with the stream and the current, that's just the way we consume food nowadays. Is just sort of the social norm that's around food consumption. I'm not aware of any research on this, but what I find really interesting is a lot of social media out, for example, on Instagram, a lot of influencers now. I think there's now pretty much for any culture, and often country sort of specific as well, you have people on Instagram who are sort of vegan food chefs, which I think is a great source of inspiration and also knowledge of how to cook more vegan dishes. I specifically saw a series recently which was rediscovering dishes that are traditionally plant-based in specific, I think it was Italy, specifically showcasing these dishes that are actually traditional but also vegan by default. So I think more research needs to be done on specifically on this, how we can build knowledge and awareness and change people's cooking behavior as well.
And working with chefs, I think also chefs and food writers, you know, are making vegetarian dishes easy and
Yeah.
you know, interesting.
One
And there are, of course, Chris Smith, by the way, Paul, is the person you're probably thinking about. He's a virologist and fellow at Queen's.
Chris Smith at Newnham College. Is that? No, I think it's someone
No,
else.
it's not that one. Because there's also the Chris Smith. Theo, you have another question or comment?
Yes, just a comment. In fact, that as much as I agree that obviously there's a huge amount to be done to debunk a lot of the myths and misconceptions around vegetarian and vegan food, I think we shouldn't dismiss the real concerns around the complexity of having a completely meat-free diet for many people. I do think there are valid concerns around your ability to access not just protein. I think protein is fairly straightforward, but a whole range of other things that, you know, more trace vitamins and minerals. I'm not a nutritionist that you get from meat. And, you know, obviously, if you live in the West and you can buy sophisticated supplements and employ a nutritionist, I mean, a great example is Mo Farah. I mean, the Olympic runner, he's a vegetarian. And so, you know, surely if he can get enough energy from it, it should be possible. But, you know, he has a team of nutritionists. And I think that's why the Eat Lancet went down the route of saying that we're not saying that it's necessary, practical, or even sensible for everyone to eat no meat. But there's a huge range of opportunity between people eating unhealthy amounts of meat on a quantity rather than quality basis versus people treating meat as like a speciality in their diet, as of course used to be the case before we had this abundant access to cheap meat. And so I think it will be more saleable to have a drive for quality rather than quantity, and for people to see it as something that's significant from a luxury point of view, a culture point of view, and so on, and to get it out of our diets as something that you do just to get full every day. And that you do eat it, if you are going to eat it, as part of a balanced and healthy diet, but that if you are going to go fully vegan and fully vegetarian, especially fully vegan, it probably ultimately becomes more of an ethical decision linked to animal welfare than maybe fully linked to, although I do take Paul's points earlier about the complexity around meat production, but it depends a lot on what kind of meat. You know, there's a huge difference between it being a lot of cattle versus it being chickens, for example. And so there's all that has to be looked at. But so anyway, I'm in the camp with the flexitarians rather than the vegans or the vegetarians. But yes, obviously we do need to get everyone to eat a lot less meat, while appreciating that there are parts of the world where people aren't going to be able to go and buy supplements or do all of that, or where they can't do dry cropping. They're going to have to do their goats or whatever they've been doing for centuries, and that probably is the only option for them realistically in the short term.
Yeah.
No, I agree. Quality.
But on influencers, I did once hear somebody quip at a talk where they said the best way to save the world is to pay Kim Kardashian to become a vegetarian or a vegan. I can't remember which they said, and I thought that like flippant statement probably contains a lot of wisdom.
That's very true. Paul, a very final question, or question possibly, before we close. Are you looking, or is there research into finding ways to influence groups in certain countries where people are becoming wealthier, and as a result they start consuming more meat because it's associated with that shift in social structure? How could we in a way create interventions and collaborations with these countries to actually not avoid that they make our own mistakes, and we help them?
That's a great question. There's been very little research, I think, especially in sort of emerging economies. We're trying to do perhaps something in China, again, from a more educational perspective. But again, it would be with students, which again is a very specific segment of the population. Yeah, I think that's a very promising research agenda.
I think working with governments, working with community groups, and say countries like Mexico, Nigeria, India, China, they're all emerging economies, and the amount of meat is increasing, and they're actually abandoning traditional dishes with pulses, obviously, for example, because in certain categories in the olden days, pulses were associated with being poor. And so there is that shift. So it would be good to sort of, prevent that change. But I must stop here, otherwise I could just go on for the whole afternoon, because I love this topic. Thank you so much, Paul. It was fantastic. And yes, thank you so much again. Thanks, everyone. I'm sorry that if you had to drop out, but obviously they had meetings and things. So, but I'm glad that they joined the first half at least. And yeah, have a good weekend. Unless, Paul, do you have a very final comment or?
No, thank you all for coming. It was great to meet you all, and yeah, enjoy the weekend.
Yes, you too. Bye bye. Take care.
Bye.